This old workshop, it's my sanctuary now, full of things built to last. Unlike some empires, they called me too expensive, a relic from a bygone era. Fired me at 58 with a smirk. He thought he was cutting costs. He had no idea he was cutting the only thread holding his father's entire company together. He never saw the crash coming. But I did, and I simply nodded. This old workbench, it's seen a fair few years. More than I care to count some days. I find a certain peace in it, you know? Taking something apart, understanding how it all fits together, making it whole again. There's an honesty in well-made things, a logic. It's a far cry from the world I used to inhabit, the world of Sterling manufacturing. That place, it was old Mr. Sterling's heart and soul, built from the ground up with grit and a handshake. He was a man who understood the value of things that lasted, people included. I suppose I was one of those people included. Arthur Jenkins, Head. Systems Architect. Sounds grand, doesn't it? In truth, for over 2 decades I was the quiet fellow in the back, the one who kept the lights on, metaphorically speaking. The company's lifeblood, the Olympian, was my creation. Not just a machine, mind you, but an entire ecosystem I designed and built from scratch, long before these fancy cloud servers and app stores. It handled everything. Inventory that stretched across 3 states, the intricate dance of supply, chain logistics, every nut and bolt ordered, every invoice paid, even the complex sequencing for some of our proprietary machining processes on the factory floor. The Olympian lived in its own climate-controlled cathedral, humming away. COBOL was its mother tongue, with a fair bit of assembly for the real heavy lifting, talking directly to the custom hardware Mr. Sterling Sr. had invested in back in the 70s. JCL scripts, like intricate symphonies, orchestrated its nightly ballets of data processing. Patches? Oh, there were patches. Workarounds developed over midnight coffees and weekends, undocumented because, well, who else needed to know? Mr. Sterling Sr. trusted me. If Arthur says it works, he'd tell the board. He knew the Olympian was more art than science. By then, a complex tapestry woven from years of adapting to the company's growth. He was a good man, Mr. Sterling Sr. Understood that true efficiency wasn't about the shiniest new toy, but about reliability, about systems and people you could count on. He'd often stop by the computer room, not to meddle, but just to watch, a look of quiet pride on his face. "Still ticking, Arthur?" he'd ask, and I'd nod. "Like a Swiss watch, Mr. Sterling." We had an understanding, him and I. He respected the craft, the dedication. He knew the Olympian wasn't just lines of code. It was the company's memory, its central nervous system. Then, as all things do, times began to change. Mr. Sterling Sr. started talking about slowing down, enjoying his grandkids. His son, Lawrence, or Larry, as he preferred, began to appear more frequently. Larry was a different breed altogether. Fresh out of business school, armed with a vocabulary full of synergy and disruption, but with eyes that seemed to glazed over whenever the actual mechanics of the business were discussed. He'd walk through the factory floor with a pained expression, as if the smell of honest work offended his sensibilities. He'd sometimes saunter into the Olympian's domain, usually on his way to somewhere more important. He'd glance at the whirring tape drives and blinking console lights with a dismissive air. "Still running this antique, Arthur?" he'd ask, not really waiting for an answer. To him, the Olympian was an embarrassing relic, a symbol of everything he thought was wrong with his father's outdated company. He saw me, I suppose, as an extension of that relic. Dependable, certainly, but ultimately replaceable. part of the old guard that needed to be swept away for his grand modern vision. I saw the writing on the wall, or rather, in the slick, glossy brochures for enterprise solutions he started leaving on conference tables. He didn't understand the Olympian. He didn't want to understand it. He saw a cost center, not the critical engine driving every single Sterling manufacturing operation. He saw a gray-haired engineer, not the decades of institutional knowledge walking around in a slightly worn cardigan. That kind of willful ignorance, it has a way of breeding arrogance. And arrogance, my friends, is a powerful blinder. It stops you from seeing the cracks in your own foundation until the whole structure starts to groan. Mr. Sterling Sr. had built his company on solid ground, on respect for the intricate workings of his business and the people who understood them. Larry was about to learn that some foundations are more critical than others, and some relics are the only things holding the roof up. He just didn't know it yet. The shift was palpable when Mr. Sterling Sr. finally announced his retirement. It felt like the old anchor had been pulled up, and the ship was suddenly at the mercy of a captain who only knew how to read the weather report, not the currents beneath. Larry's new office, all chrome and glass, felt cold compared to his father's warm, wood-paneled den. It was clear a new wind was blowing, and it wasn't a gentle one. But even then, I just kept my head down, kept the Olympian humming. That was my job, my commitment. Loyalty, however, is a two-way street, and some people, they only look at the cost of the toll, never the value of the road. Do you believe quiet strength is often underestimated? Share your thoughts below. The call came on a Tuesday. Arthur, Mr. Sterling would like to see you in his office, now. That was Larry's new assistant, voice clipped and efficient, like everything else in his modernized Sterling manufacturing. I had a feeling, a knot in my stomach that had been tightening for weeks. The Olympian was running its month-end reports, a particularly complex batch job I always monitored closely, but I saved my current work and headed towards the lion's den, as some of the older engineers had started calling Larry's office. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. Lounging in his oversized leather chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, Larry gestured vaguely towards one of the uncomfortable modern chairs opposite his gleaming desk. "Arthur," he began, flipping a pen between his fingers as if he were bored already. "We've been reviewing operations, as you know, looking for efficiencies, new synergies." He used that word a lot, synergy. I don't think he truly knew what it meant, other than it sounded good in a boardroom. "The fact is, Arthur," he continued, finally meeting my gaze, his eyes cold and dismissive, "your role here, and that Olympian system, they're from a different era. We're streamlining, and frankly, your salary is significant." He paused, letting that hang in the air. "To be blunt, we can get 2, maybe 3 younger programmers fresh out of college for what we're paying you. It's just business, Arthur. Nothing personal. The casual cruelty of it, the utter disregard for decades of service, it stung more than the financial implication." He slid a thin folder across the polished expanse of his desk. "Standard severance. 2 months, your accrued vacation. All very generous, considering." Generous? For 23 years of my life, for the system that was Sterling Manufacturing. I looked at him, this young man who had inherited a kingdom he clearly didn't understand, who saw a complex, vital organ as a simple, outdated cog. His arrogance was breathtaking. He truly believed he could just unplug me, unplug the Olympian, and plug in some off-the-shelf software without a ripple. He was so sure of himself, so confident in his modern approach. He didn't ask about transition, about documentation, which he'd consistently refused to fund for years, despite my warnings. He didn't ask about the critical processes, the unwritten knowledge locked in my head. He just saw an old man and an old machine, both ripe for the scrap heap. "The Olympian is old tech." He waved a hand dismissively. "We're looking at new platforms, agile solutions. The future, Arthur." I remember the silence in that room, broken only by the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. I could feel the weight of his decision, the casual dismissal of my life's work. There was a part of me, a small hot ember that wanted to rage, to list every single critical function I performed, every late night I'd spent keeping his father's company running smoothly while he was probably out celebrating some minor business school triumph. I wanted to tell him just how deep the roots of the Olympian went, how intertwined they were with every aspect of sterling manufacturing. But then a strange calm settled over me. What was the point? He wouldn't hear it. He wouldn't understand. His mind was made up, fueled by a dangerous combination of ignorance and ego. Arguing would be like explaining calculus to a toddler. He'd already decided I was obsolete. So I met his gaze, kept my voice even, my expression, I hoped, unreadable. I reached for the folder, didn't open it. "Understood, Mr. Sterling," I said, the formality a deliberate choice, a subtle echo of the respect I'd always shown his father, a respect he himself hadn't earned. "I wish you and the company well." I rose slowly, the old joints protesting a little, or maybe it was just the weight of the moment. He looked almost disappointed. Perhaps he'd expected a scene, a fight, something to validate his decision, to his own conscience or to the board. But I gave him nothing. No anger, no pleading, just a quiet acknowledgement of his decree. As I walked out, past the nervous glances of his assistant, I remember thinking, he has no idea at all. He saw an expense to be cut, not a pillar about to be removed. He thought he was being clever, decisive. He was, in fact, being catastrophically foolish. Back in the Olympian's room, the lights blinked faithfully. The tape drives whirred their familiar song. It felt like saying goodbye to an old, loyal friend. I gathered my few personal items, a worn copy of a programming manual, a photo of my wife, a coffee mug that had seen countless early mornings. It all fit into one small, unassuming box. The end of an era reduced to cardboard. The betrayal cut deep. But they had no idea what I was capable of. Keep watching Revenge with Alex to see how the tables turned. Driving home that afternoon, the small box of my sterling manufacturing life on the passenger seat, I didn't feel anger, not yet. That would come later, in quiet waves. What I felt was a profound sense of inevitability. It was like watching a child run towards a cliff edge convinced he could fly. You could shout, but he wouldn't listen. Larry had made his choice, set his course, and I, in that moment, made mine. I wouldn't lift a finger. Not one. My strategic plan, if you could call it that, was born of a deep, righteous indignation, a decision to simply let the consequences of his arrogance play out. My wife, bless her, was furious on my behalf when I told her. "How could they?" she'd fumed. "After everything you've done for that company, for his father." I just shrugged. "It's business, dear," I said, echoing Larry's own dismissive words, though my tone was far from his. I started puttering in the garden more, finally tackled that leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. An unwanted early retirement, yes, but there was also a strange sense of release. The immense pressure of keeping the Olympian, and by extension, sterling manufacturing, alive and well, was suddenly lifted. It was now someone else's problem. A problem, I suspected, they were woefully unprepared for. I knew the Olympian. I knew its strengths, its quirks, its hidden fragilities. I knew the precise sequence of operations needed for the critical month-end financial consolidations. I knew which obscure error codes meant impending disaster and which were merely the system, grumbling in its sleep. I knew the undocumented workarounds for the aging disk controllers and the temperamental tape readers. All that knowledge, accumulated over 23 years, walked out the door with me, packed away in my head, not in any manual Larry would ever find, because he'd never deemed it worthy of investment. Word trickled back, as it always does, in these situations. Old colleagues calling under the pretense of seeing how I was would let slip little nuggets. Larry had hired 2 young men, bright sparks fresh from university, full of enthusiasm for Python and Java, but who looked at COBOL listings like they were ancient Sumerian texts. They were tasked with understanding and maintaining the Olympian, while a new off-the-shelf enterprise resource planning system was sourced and implemented, a process I knew that would take at least a year, probably 2, if done properly. The first signs were subtle, almost unnoticeable to the untrained eye. A slight delay in the overnight batch processing. An inventory report that didn't quite reconcile with the previous day's figures. Minor discrepancies in shipping manifests. I could almost picture the scene. The young programmers, bleary-eyed, poring over reams of printouts trying to decipher my decades-old logic, probably blaming legacy code for their own lack of understanding. Larry, I imagined, would be impatient, demanding quick fixes, not understanding that the Olympian was like a finely tuned watch. You couldn't just hammer at the gears if it started losing time. Then came the bigger tremors, the automated reordering. System for critical raw materials started failing intermittently. Production schedules, spat out by the Olympian based on complex algorithms I'd refined over years, began to show illogical sequences, threatening to halt assembly lines. These weren't just minor glitches anymore. These were impacting the core business. I pictured Larry, his smug confidence perhaps beginning to fray at the edges, pressuring his new, inexperienced team, who were likely applying superficial patches, that, in the intricate ecosystem of the Olympian, could create far more problems than they solved. One of the Olympian's most crucial tasks was the weekly payroll run for nearly 500 employees. It was a complex beast, factoring in overtime, shift differentials, union dues, and a dozen other variables, all hard-coded and meticulously tested by me over the years. It had never once failed. Until, about 6 weeks after my departure, it did. Not a complete failure, not yet, but paychecks were delayed, amounts were wrong. The kind of error that makes employees very, very unhappy, and HR departments very, very stressed. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in their struggles, not in that way. But there was a grim vindication. This was the cost-saving Larry had been so proud of. This was the efficiency he'd promised. He'd traded decades of proven, albeit expensive, expertise for cheap, inexperienced labor, and now the cracks were not just showing, they were widening into chasms. He thought he was a modern visionary, but he was just a fool who'd thrown away the company's most vital, albeit unglamorous, asset. My patience wasn't an act of malice, it was an act of allowing truth to surface. I had given Sterling Manufacturing my best, my loyalty, my expertise. They, under Larry's new leadership, had deemed it worthless. So, I waited. I knew the Olympian's breaking point. I knew its most vulnerable, undocumented processes. It wasn't a matter of if a catastrophic failure would occur, but when. And when it did, there would be no one left who could coax it back to life. The system wasn't designed to be user-friendly for novices. It was designed to be robust and reliable under the hand of someone who understood its soul, and its soul had just walked out the door. If you enjoy seeing clever strategy overcome injustice, make sure you subscribe to Revenge with Alex. The call I knew was coming finally arrived on a blustery Monday morning, about 3 months after my unceremonious exit. It wasn't Larry, not at first. It was his increasingly frantic head of finance, a man I'd always found reasonably competent, if a bit overwhelmed. "Arthur," he said, his voice strained, We have a situation. The Olympian, it's completely down. Nothing is processing. Month-end close is tomorrow, and we can't get anything out of it. Could you possibly come in, just to look?" I politely declined, stating my retirement was final. He sounded desperate when he hung up. Then the calls from Larry started. The first one was almost demanding, an order thinly veiled as a request. "Jenkins, we need you. The system's crashed. Get down here." I calmly explained again that I was retired. His tone shifted over the next few hours through a series of increasingly panicked voicemails and direct calls, from arrogant to pleading, then to something bordering on hysteria. "Arthur, please, name your price. We'll double your old salary, a consultancy fee, whatever you want. Just make it work." He sounded like a drowning man. The news reports started filtering out a few days later. Sterling Manufacturing faces massive system outage. Production halted at major industrial supplier. The Olympian, my old, faithful workhorse, had finally given up the ghost under the clumsy ministrations of its new, unqualified guardians. Apparently, a minor power surge, something its robust surge protectors should have handled, combined with a poorly implemented fix by the new team for an earlier data corruption issue, had caused a cascade failure. Critical system files were wiped. Backup tapes, which required a specific, complex restoration sequence only I knew intimately, were proving useless in their hands. They were flying in so-called mainframe gurus from across the country. But the Olympian wasn't just any mainframe. It was my mainframe, a unique beast full of custom code and undocumented intricacies. Sterling Manufacturing was bleeding. Millions per day, the papers speculated. No orders processed, no parts shipped, no invoices generated, no payments collected. Manufacturing lines, some of which had their control sequences fed directly from the Olympian, were silent. Key clients with just-in-time supply chains were screaming. Contractual penalties for non-delivery were mounting astronomically. Larry, the brilliant young CEO who was going to modernize and cut costs, was presiding over the wholesale destruction of his father's legacy. His grand vision had imploded, brought down by his contempt for the obsolete. The final act came about 6 weeks after the crash. I read it in the business section of the local paper, a small, somber headline. Sterling Manufacturing Files for Chapter 7, Bankruptcy. Liquidation. The end. All those years, all that history, all of old Mr. Sterling Sr.'s hard work, gone. Wiped out by an avalanche that started with one arrogant decision, one callous dismissal. Larry's cost-saving measure of firing me had cost him everything. His company, his reputation, his father's legacy, all because he wouldn't or couldn't see the value in the quiet, steady hand that had kept it all running. There was no triumph in that news, not for me. A profound sadness, actually, for old Mr. Sterling, for the good people who lost their jobs because of one man's hubris. But there was also a quiet, undeniable sense of vindication. Not for revenge, but for the principle of the thing. Value isn't always shiny and new. Experience isn't just a line item on a budget, easily erased. And sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is to simply step back and let the natural consequences of folly unfold. I never spoke to Larry again. What was there to say? Looking back now, from the peace of this workshop, surrounded. By things I understand, things I've built with care, I see it clearly. He called me obsolete. He called my life's work an antique. But it was his understanding that was lacking, his vision that was fatally flawed. He tried to save a few dollars, and in doing so, torched an entire forest. A hard lesson. A very, very expensive lesson. My garden out back, it's thriving. I tend it carefully, give it what it needs. Respect the process. Some things, you see, you just can't rush. And you certainly can't devalue the hands that nurture them without expecting a bitter harvest. The Olympian, in its own way, taught Larry Sterling that. It was its last, silent, and most definitive lesson. And me. I simply nodded back then, when he sealed his own fate. And I nod now, knowing that sometimes justice doesn't need a shout. Sometimes it's a quiet, inevitable unfolding. A system correcting itself. Did this story of long-game justice resonate with you? Hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to see it. Love this story? Tell us what city you're watching Revenge with Alex from in the comments below.